In this video, I'll give you an overview of the Enneagram as part of my personality framework series. I'll cover the basics of the system, its strengths and weaknesses, and give you a couple of resources to look up if you'd like to learn more. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the main concept behind the Enneagram is that it describes its personality types as a form of coping mechanism for a set of core fears. And so in doing so, one of its assumptions is that these fears are developed in early childhood. And so this personality framework is based on environment mediation. So it's not really like innate, or at least it might be a mix, but really the way the Enneagram construct personality is more based on your childhood or past experiences that kind of shaped some fears and some sets of behaviors in you. And this way is different from other different types of personality frameworks, such as, for example, the Jungian ones, which are mostly more about like innate psychological plumbing, so to speak, or makeup of your mind, which are not that much really affected by social environment and forming experiences. The Enneagram is based on archetypes. So it's really focused on behavioral patterns of each of its personality types, the underlying motivations behind these behaviors, and the growth path they can go through. Basically, kind of the types of actions or behaviors or mindset that are going to lead to them becoming healthier and more integrated versus those that are going to make them less healthy and more dysfunctional. The origins of the system is pretty murky. It's based on the Enneagram symbol, which you'll see on the thumbnail and as a backdrop of the video. This kind of circle with this geometrical shape inside. And it was picked up by George Gurdjieff in the early 20th century, although presumably it's an older symbol that's been there for a while. He wasn't using it for personality, though, but it influenced Oscar Ichazo, and in turn, Ichazo influenced and inspired Claudio Naranjo, which are two of the most noteworthy pioneer theorists of our contemporary understanding of the Enneagram. And so they did this work in the 1950s and then 70s, respectively. And then, that work inspired other theorists, such as Hudson and Riso, and also Catherine Fauvre, which will be mentioned a little bit further. So I'll explain the 9 Enneatypes, types, which are basically the 9 types that exist within the Enneagram, which are all regrouped within 3 main triads. So basically there's 3 groups of 3. For the sake of brevity, I'll be summarizing and caricaturing a little bit each types, because I think it helps kind of convey a good idea or a good feel for it quickly, even if it's not the most nuanced explanation necessarily. So if you want kind of more nuanced and depth, then you can do it through further research. So as I said, there are 3 triads, and we'll start with the heart triad, which is more based around emotionality, I guess. And so these are types that tend to struggle with identity and hostility. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is strongly influenced by Hudson and Riso's book, Personality Types. So that's where I'm basing a lot of this information. And so we will use their order, because since we're grouping them by triads, we'll actually be starting with the personality number 2 instead of the number 1, for a reason that you'll understand afterwards. So this first triad is made of the Enneatypes 2, 3, and 4. So 2 is called the helper or giver. I mean, it's got many names, but that's kind of the general gist of this archetype. And so this type's core fear is of being unwanted, unworthy of being loved. And so their basic desire or motivation is to be loved unconditionally. And the strategy they used in order to try to achieve this yearning is to give love in order to get love. It's kind of a form of people-pleasing or generosity, and also like a selfless nature, but it's kind of a selfless nature that's also going to trying to get something, or basically trying to be loved in exchange for their generosity. And so this type is strongly correlated with the general way we tend to think about the social archetype of femininity, what you could say. Although, of course, it's not, not only women are Enneatype 2 there's also men's, but it's just in terms of archetype, it tend to be pretty correlated because it's all about nurturing and to an extent seduction. And so on the healthier side of the spectrum, so on the healthier side of the expression of this type, you would get kind of the archetype of the nurturing mother. And on the more unhealthy side, you'd get, codependent pattern where basically the Enneagram type 2 kind of tries to make other people dependent on them in order to keep getting this validation or this kind of helping them in order to feel loved. Then we have the third, or the Enneagram type number 3, which is also part of the heart triad. And so this is the archetype of the achiever or performer. And this type's core fear is of being worthless. And so their basic desire is to feel valuable and worthwhile because they feel like they'll disappoint others otherwise. And so their strategy is to conform to and exceed social expectations, usually by being successful, either through genuine efforts or deception if they have to. And so in terms of archetype, this is kind of the successful businessman type of person, the hustler, and on the less healthy side, kind of the fraudster and con artist if they need to use deception in order to get a positive reputation. And so part of this type is that because they are very focused on external expectations and criteria for success, sometimes they're not super in tune with themselves or what they truly want or truly feel. And so I think the following quote from Dropping Thunder is can humorously describe some aspects of this type that goes, "Me, I know who I am. I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude." And moving on to the last type in this triad, we have the individualist or romantic. And so this type's core fear is that they have no identity or personal significance, that they are more inherently flawed than others, that they are missing something that others have. And so their basic desire is to find themselves and their significance, to create an identity out of their inner experience. And so their strategy is trying to be very unique, to be kind of a special snowflake, and that involves a lot of introspective absorption, kind of being very in tune with their inner states and moods and trying to express them. And so that corresponds to an archetype. Obviously, these archetypes are kind of reduced. It can be more complicated, as I said, but generally this is associated with the archetype of the moody, tortured artist, and also to an extent the drama queen, because they're so absorbed into their inner states and how they feel. And a quote that I feel kind of describes Enneagram 4 decently is, "They laugh at me because I'm different. I laugh at them because they're all the same," from the song Alien by The N-Word, although it might come from somewhere else, but that's where I got it. And so these are the three types within the herd triad which struggle with identity and hostility. So that was the first triad. Moving on to the second one, which is the head triad, which is more focused on thinking. And these three types, 5, 6, and 7, struggle with insecurity and anxiety. So the first type in that triad, the 5, is usually called the investigator or the observer. And their core fear is of being helpless, useless, incapable, and therefore their core need is to be capable and competent, to have something to contribute. And their strategy tends to be to hoard information, to learn as much as possible, to prepare, and to avoid the external world and external responsibilities because they don't really feel like they can handle that. And so instead they kind of try to control everything through information. And in terms of archetypes, because of their patterns, it tends to be kind of the reclusive hermit and kind of the offbeat intellectual, which kind of comes off with more, sometimes weird theories. The type is pretty well summarized in this quote from Richard Riso and Russ Hudson's Personality Types book, which goes into 5. We see the genius and the madman, the innovator and intellectual, the mildly eccentric crackpot, and the deeply disturbed delusional schizoid, which I like quite a bit, being a 5 myself. Moving on to the type 6, which is usually called the loyalist or the loyal skeptic. Their core fear is of being unable to survive on their own, of having no support, and so their core need or desire is to find security and support to belong somewhere. And so their strategy is to try to kind of suss out and prevent potential harm and to seek safety and reliability, especially in groups or organizations or kind of these structured external frameworks. And so in terms of archetype, they're a pretty fluid type, but some of the tropes which are associated with them is kind of being paranoid and kind of switching their types of behaviors. There's a whole concept of phobic and counterphobic, where basically the phobic behavior will try to avoid danger and will be very paranoid, and then counterphobic behavior will be pretty aggressive because they're trying to overcompensate for their fear by kind of being aggressive and trying to fend off potential threats. It can also be associated with a different kind of form of intellectual person, in contrast to the 5, which will be a little bit more scientific-y to an extent because their skepticism is a bit more methodical and they're more community-driven. So there's this whole idea of community consensus and kind of establishing official, trustworthy versus untrustworthy sources of knowledge is more 6-ish, so to speak, than 5-ish. And so that's about it for the 6. Moving on to the 7. So the 7 Enneatype is called usually the enthusiast or the epicure, and their core fear is pain and deprivation, and so their core desire is to be satisfied and content, to have their needs fulfilled. And usually their strategy is to try to distract themselves from bad thoughts or bad feelings through constant activity and having fun and enjoying themselves. And so, the archetype will be kind of the life of the party, the entertainer, and also to an extent, the hedonist. And I think a good, kind of representation of the type is found in Sia's song Chandelier. I mean, basically all the lyrics apply, but I'll just share the first couple lines, which go, "Party girls don't get hurt, can't feel anything, when will I learn? I push it down, I'm the one for a good time call." And so that will do it for this type. And so with that, we finish the head triad, which revolves more about thinking. And lastly, we have the third triad, which is the gut triad, more about instinct, and who struggle with repression and aggression. And basically the number 1 type is part of this triad, and that's why it was put at the end, in order to keep the sorting by triad. So the first type in that triad is the number 8, which is usually called the challenger or the protector. And their core fear is of being harmed or controlled by others, and therefore their core desire is to protect themselves, to get into control of their environment. And so their strategy tend to be to kind of get what they want. They're pretty in tune with what they want, and to kind of get it through action and sometimes force if required. And in this way, their archetype is really correlated with the generally accepted archetype of masculinity. Again, you can have a female Enneatype 8, but it's just in the way it acts, the 8 tends to be the most correlated with the masculine archetype, and the 2 the most correlated with the feminine archetype, because this type is pretty similar to that of kind of the warrior, that can range from kind of the hero that fights against tyranny on the healthier side to the tyrant themselves or the bully on the less healthy side. Then we have the number 9 Enneatype, which is called peacemaker or mediator, and this type's core fear is of loss and separation or impermanence, and their core need is to have inner stability or peace of mind. And so their strategy tends to be to smooth over rough edges, to sacrifice secondary preferences, to maintain harmony, to avoid conflict, and to avoid also drastic changes. And in terms of archetype, well, as the name implies, it can be the mediator that kind of helps bring peace to other people, but it also kind of tend to apply, or the archetype tends to be kind of the chilled out underachiever, the loafer, kind of sometimes a stoner. The dude from The Big Lebowski is a good example of a type 9. And lastly, although it's technically the first. We have type 1, which is called the reformer or perfectionist. And so their core fear is of being corrupt, evil, and defective or imbalanced. And their core need is to be good, to have integrity, to be in balance with everything. And so their strategy is that they have these very strong can be pretty rigid principles that they try to apply to themselves, but also to others. And so in this way, they can be kind of annoying because they can be pretty naggy and imposing their principles on everybody else, and also can be on the less healthy side, fairly hypocritical. I'd say that one concept that's pretty associated with this type is the super ego, so the kind of conscious list of things you should or shouldn't do. And on the healthier side, as the name implies, it can be motivate big changes toward more justice, the reformer. But the less healthy style, they can be very hypocritical and judgmental in ways which are not very productive. So that's a quick overview of the main types, of course, of the 9 types. As I said, they're pretty short and just kind of really give the gist. But just so you have a general idea, and then you can learn more about it and all the details later if you're interested. So on top of these 9 types, we have a lot of interconnections between one another, all of them. So as you can see, first, all the types are kind of arranged on a circle. And so each kind of type is made up kind of from the tensions between the types surrounding them. And so there's this concept of wings. And so basically the idea is that among all the 9 types, one type will be the one that's, that applies the best to you. So that's your core type. But, you'll lean towards one of the 2 types next to it. And you'll lean stronger towards one of them. And so that is your wing. So if you're a 1, for example, you could be either a 1 with a 2 wing or a 9 wing, because those are the 2 types that are next to it. If you're a type 6, you could have a 5 or a 7 wing. So that kind of helps give a little bit more nuance on the type, on any person's type, by giving kind of a preference or leaning towards another type. On top of that, and more important in terms of the whole growth aspect of the system, is this concept of integration and disintegration. So the idea is that types grow healthy when they grow healthy, they tend to embody healthy traits of another type. And when they disintegrate, so when they kind of do less healthy behavior, when they kind of devolve, they'll take on the characteristics of another type. And so there's like a direction of integration and disintegration, which is represented in the lines that you can see in the geometrical shape. So integration so there's like 2 different circuits, so to speak. You've got the simpler triangle in the middle, so where 3 integrates into 6, 6 integrates into 9, and 9 integrates into 3. Sorry. So that's a cyclical pattern, and then the disintegration is the opposite order. So 3 disintegrates into 9, 9 disintegrates into 6, and 6 disintegrates into 3. And then for the other, you have 1 integrates into 7, which integrates into 5, which integrates into 8, which integrates into 4, which integrates into 1, and then the opposite order for disintegration. Depending on the theorist, this integration and disintegration is unidirectional. So basically when you integrate, you'll just kind of start exhibiting traits of a healthy type of integration. And when you disintegrate, or basically when you get less healthy, you'll only exhibit traits from your disintegration type. But according to other theorists, including Catherine Fauver, basically when you integrate, you'll exhibit traits, healthy traits of both your integration and disintegration type. So basically it's kind of, there's not really an integration and a disintegration type. You kind of, each type is connected to 2 others, and they'll, in both healthy and unhealthy, they'll exhibit traits of these other 2 types. So that's kind of the basics of the series, but then there's kind of a lot of supplemental add-ons you can add to it, I guess. So for example, Hudson and Riso in their book, they list levels of healthiness for each type. So in their books, they give 9 levels of healthiness for each type. So there's like basically 3 levels for healthy, 3 levels for average, and 3 levels for unhealthy. And with each of these intermediary steps or layers, you also have specific fears. So basically, some people might not relate with any of the core fears of each of the 9 types, but then they give a more layered level where each fears has kind of intermediary fears that feed into one another. Another popular kind of add-on or other component of the system is instinctual variance. And so these are basically there's 3 of them. Self-preservation, which is symbolized by the letters SP, and it's all about kind of protecting yourself and, well, basically self-preservation. The second is sexual, which is symbolized as sex, and it's more about basically, it's not really necessarily sexual, it's more about focusing on building one-on-one connections with people. And the last is, the last is, in my order at least, is social, which is symbolized SO. And so these are the 3 instinctual variants, and the idea is that you've got one that's your primary motivator, one that's your secondary, and the last one is blind. So basically, you're not really super aware of this one, and you're not very good at it, but you don't really care about it either. So that kind of adds on top of your type and gives a bit more information, and there are some pretty in detail profile description for each type that is influenced by each of these instinctual variants. So basically, if you take a type, let's say 9, for example, there will be some variation depending on which instinctual variants they have. And then another add-on system to an extent is the tri-type by Catherine Favre. And so basically, based on her observations, she came to the conclusion that basically for each person will actually relate with one type from each triad. So each person will actually relate most with one type of the emotional triad, one of the thinking, and one of the instinctive. And so that's the tri-type, is basically those 3 types with which you relate the most. And so these give us 27 tri-type combination. And this blending of 3 different types gives up those tri-types, which have a lot more specificity, a lot more details, and the interplay between the different types kind of give interesting information, which I found quite insightful. So if you get interested into the Enneagram, I definitely recommend checking tri-types out. Lastly, I like to mention the directional theory, which is something I found out later, which is kind of a more structured, logical, theoretical explanation behind each type. I'll quickly read a quote from the article I read on this topic, which says that in 1945, the psychoanalyst Karen Horney proposed 3 personality categories, which were later used to categorize the Enneagram types. Horney described aggressive, withdrawn, and compliant personality types, which move against, away from, or towards the environment. This triad may have biological root. Aggression, withdrawal, and compliance are probably related to the fight, flight, or submit behaviors observed in a wide range of animals. And so basically, with using these 3 types of behaviors or preference for one type of behavior between aggressive, withdrawn, and compliant, you can kind of make a 3x3 matrix, and then you get those 3 types. So if you're interested, I'll put a link to this in the description. To summarize, I'll just read a couple of quotes from the book Personality Types. So if we kind of recap the main prize and temptations of each type, I'll start reading that quote. So each of the personality types is tempted toward a particular form of pride as a way of defending itself from the anxieties involved with its existence. The 9th temptation is to believe that its tranquility is an ultimate value. The 8th is to believe in its own strength and will. The 7th is to believe that it will find fulfillment in exciting experiences. The sixes is to believe that it can create ultimate security for itself. The fives is to believe in knowledge as a source of power. The fours is to believe that all of its feelings and subjective states are significant. The threes is to believe in its own excellence. The twos is to believe in its own indispensability. And the one's temptation is to believe in its own righteousness. Then, in terms of vicious loops, we have the following quotes. Thus, the twos spend their whole lives searching for love from others and still feel that they are unloved. Threes endlessly pursue achievement and recognition but still feel worthless and empty. Fours spend their entire lives trying to discover the meaning of their personal identity and still do not know who they are. Fives endlessly accumulate knowledge and skills to build up their confidence but still feel helpless and incapable. Sixes toil endlessly to create security for themselves and still feel anxious and fearful about the world. Sevens look high and low for happiness but still feel unhappy and frustrated. Eights do everything in their power to protect themselves and their interests but still feel vulnerable and threatened. Nines sacrifice a great deal to achieve inner peace and stability but still feel ungrounded and insecure. And finally, ones strive to maintain personal integrity but still feel divided and at war with themselves. And lastly, a final quote on the topic of disintegration as a path of least resistance and what is a real way out to kind of grow and get healthier. So it goes. It is worth noting that movement in the direction of disintegration is the path of least resistance and is a result of acting on the habitual mechanisms of our personality. On the other hand, the direction of integration always involves conscious choices and effort, although not the effort of striving and straining or condemning ourselves for our failures. Indeed, most of these efforts usually result in inner conflict, increased anxiety, and may even cause a descent into lower levels of the continuum. Rather, the effort required to move in the direction of integration is the effort of letting go of our old personality patterns. So that's a general overview of the system. Moving on strengths and weaknesses. So on the strengths level, the Enneagram is very focused on self-development. And even if you're not super convinced by the typology itself, some of the dysfunctional behaviors it describes, as well as the solution it proposes for them, might inspire you, make you think about things. Another plus it has is that it is very accessible. It's pretty quick to understand and learn. It's easy to share. It's not super theoretically dense, although you can make it more dense, and that's another advantage because it's pretty modular with these kind of add-on sub-series that can add granularity and complexity to it. But by default, it's pretty intuitive to understand. There are a lot of theories and dichotomies and little tidbits that you need to grapple with. So it's pretty easy to use. On the weaknesses level, when you add all the wings into integration and disintegration and trait types, you kind of end up being a little bit of all the types. And so you could say that the Barnum effect could apply quite a bit in this case, where most people will kind of relate with most of the types and some of their dynamics. And that's kind of the case for me. For example, I kind of relate with most types, or I end up, if I use my core type, my wings, my integration and disintegration and trait type, I end up being most of the types except for a couple I don't really relate to, especially in my case 1, 3, and 2, for example. Another main source of criticism or weaknesses is it doesn't have a lot of basis for a lot of the claims. It tends to be a little bit arbitrary. It's just like, this is the way it is. And so, like a lot of other personality frameworks, it suffers from pseudoscience criticism. It's not really backed up in experimentation or proof, and it doesn't have a lot of supporting theory to explain how it works, although the directional theory is a potential option. But these are some of its weaknesses. So in conclusion, it's helpful in terms of archetypes. It's kind of an interesting way to think about things. It can help see some patterns of behaviors and work and ways to work on them, and what are kind of healthier or unhealthier reactions. And it can also be a good complement to other personality frameworks to give more context, because the Enneagram is very focused on behaviors and how a personality plays out, whereas some other typology systems are more centered on how a person kind of processes information in a way that might be less visible. Lastly, let's talk about where to go from there if you're interested. So there's a Wikipedia article about it, which is very summarized. It has a tables which basically kind of explains the core tidbits of information for each types. But I think that even in a very summarized format, it still works pretty well as a quick gist, so it's pretty good. There's also the Personality Database wiki, which has many quotes from these original authors for the different types and so on. So if you want to kind of read some of the theory, then that's a place you can go to. Then there's, of course, all the many different books. If you would like to use a test to figure out which types you probably are within the nines, within the 9 possibilities, the best one I've tested from the few I tried out was on the website Eclectic Energies. Now, again, I would recommend always taking these tests with a grain of salt. That website especially kind of gives us some pretty pseudoscientific or woo-woo vibes. But from the ones I tested, it was the most straightforward one. And then again, it's pretty easy, I think, to type yourself with the Enneagram. Well, according to the popular theory, some types have a lot of mistypes, especially the 6, I think. But overall, as I said, it's a pretty straightforward system, so it's not that hard to type yourself or even others. If you'd like to learn more, Catherine Favre's YouTube channel is also pretty good, whether you want to learn more about the triad types, but also even about the core types. She's got panels where they kind of do deep dives into each of these types. And lastly, within the books from the different theorists, I personally read Personality Types, and it's pretty good. So that's one option. Although I must warn that a lot of the book is just a succession of long profile descriptions for each of the 9 levels, one after the others. So that can be a little bit dry if you're just reading it one chapter after the other. But it's a pretty good book. So that about does it for this video. If you liked it, if you were interested in this topic, you might also be interested in the other videos I made. I covered the Big 5 and also Jungian typology, which includes both the Myers-Briggs type indicator and socionics. And there's also another video I did on the general topic of should you trust personality frameworks. And that's about it. So thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of it.